Welcome back to Student Renter Tips. I'm Brian. In this edition, we're going to talk about the lease. This is the governing document that is going to capture all of the agreements that you're making with your landlord. Now, the first important thing that we want to talk about is what does the lease say? Because what the lease says is what is going to govern what happens when something goes wrong, or what you're supposed to do, or what your landlord's supposed to do through the entire term of your lease. I brought with me a sample lease agreement. This was a lease that I used. There will also be a lease posted on the website if you just click one of the links. It should be right on this page. The lease agreement can sometimes be a really long and lengthy document. This particular lease agreement was 24 pages long and includes all kinds of information about the rent, the security deposit, how long the lease is, and also information about lead disclosures, holes in the wall, Proposition 65, and some utility information. So, what's interesting about this lease is that it is a form lease, and form leases are pretty much what most landlords use. This particular lease came from the California Apartment Association, and these organizations create these leases for landlords to purchase through different organizations. So it's most likely that when you sign a lease, you're going to be looking at something very similar to this document. So the lease tells you exactly what you can and can't do. If in the process of your tenancy you start to have a problem and you're unsure what your rights are, you should first go to the lease and figure out what does the lease say. It can be daunting when you are going through a lease because it's so large, but you don't need to panic. Just take your time and go through it. The first thing that a lease tells you is when is your rent due, where are you living, and how long is the lease. It includes important terms about the length of the lease because it will talk to you about things like what happens at the end of the lease. Does the lease roll over into a month-to-month? Does the tenancy end? And what sort of notice has to be given? That information will be talked about in another lecture, which you can click on the website. So, what happens if the landlord tells you something other than what's actually in the lease? That is, what happens if the landlord represents something to you that's not even the same? For instance, what if in the lease it discloses that you cannot have any pets at all? But right before you signed the lease, you talked to the landlord and the landlord said, sure, it's okay, Fido can stay with you, that's no problem at all, and I'm not even going to charge you an extra security deposit. So you move along, and for 3 months you're living with Fido and you're bliss, and something happens. The landlord comes knocking on the door and he says, why do you have a dog here? I never told you could have a dog here. And you say, well, landlord, when I signed the lease, you told me that I could have my dog. Well, the landlord doesn't like what's going on, so he decides that he's going to eject you from the apartment and he files a lawsuit. If in the process of the lawsuit, the lease is brought up, there's probably something in the lease that's called a merger clause. And in this particular clause, it's called the entire agreement clause. And what this says is that all of the representations that were made between you and your landlord are encompassed within this document, and any representations that were made outside of this document are not binding on the parties. That is to say, in our example, that whatever the landlord told you about Fido staying in your apartment would not be admissible in court. So we talked about what does the lease say and why is that important. We talked about that it can be a daunting task. We also talked about what happens if the landlord tells you something other than what's in the lease. So the leases, like I said, are mostly form leases. And for that reason, when you're in a competitive environment where there's a lot of students that are looking for places to live, it's important for you to be as prepared as you possibly can. So before you go into renting a place, perhaps it would be a good idea to take a look at the lease, like the one on our website, or any other type of form lease that will have information about the terms, about anything else that you might need on the lease. And you can look that information up on this website and other websites about what do those terms actually mean, so that when it comes time for you to sign such a binding legal document, perhaps one of the most important documents that you'll sign to this point, you'll be able to do that with confidence, and you won't have to worry about, am I signing something that I don't know? And am I agreeing to things that I'm not aware of? The second point that I want to make about it being a form lease is that take your time when you sign it. Your landlord's going to want to pressure you to get it done as quickly as possible because he's going to want to get you in. If it takes a couple hours for you to go through it, that should be fine. And if the landlord's really pressuring you not to read what's in your lease, that's probably a sign that it's not a good idea to take that place right away. And you might want to look into why would the landlord be wanting you to do that. So those are the 4 things I wanted to talk to you about the lease. And please continue on with the rest of the website and all the other subsections that will talk about what goes inside the lease, including subletting, utilities, and what happens to the lease at the end if it transforms into a month-to-month lease or it just ends. Thanks for listening.